Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The summer I turned 14 was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. My parents had arranged for me to spend 2 months with my Aunt Carmen and Uncle Roberto in Northern California, along with my twin cousins Diego and Sofia. It was my first time away from home for such an extended period, and the excitement had been building for months. California was everything I had imagined and more. The endless sunshine, the palm trees swaying in warm breezes, and the promise of theme parks and beaches made every day feel like a vacation. Carmen and Roberto lived in a modest house in Sacramento, but they had planned an incredible summer filled with activities that would make any teenager jealous. Those first 3 weeks flew by in a blur of excitement. We spent days at Six Flags, screaming our lungs out on roller coasters that defied gravity. The water parks provided relief from the scorching California heat, and I learned to body surf at Santa Cruz Beach. Diego taught me Spanish curse words that would have made my mother wash my mouth out with soap, while Sofia showed me how to braid friendship bracelets during our long car rides. Universal Studios. Hollywood was a dream come true. Walking through the movie sets, seeing the actual props from films I'd watched dozens of times, and experiencing the studio tour made me feel like I was living inside a movie myself. The Wizarding World section transported me to another universe entirely, and I must have spent a fortune on butterbeer and chocolate frogs. But it was the announcement of our camping trip that truly set my heart racing with anticipation. Carmen had been planning this adventure for months, coordinating with her longtime friend Patricia, whose family would be joining us for a week in the Redwood National and State Parks. Patricia had managed to secure a reservation at one of the remote cabins deep within the forest, a place where cell phone service was non-existent and the nearest town was over an hour's drive away. The drive north took us through landscapes that seemed pulled from a fantasy novel. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests, and soon we were surrounded by trees that stretched toward the sky like ancient cathedral pillars. The redwoods were unlike anything I had ever seen. Massive, ancient giants that had been standing for centuries before my great-grandparents were even born. When we finally arrived at the park, I was struck speechless by the sheer magnitude of these natural skyscrapers. Some of the trees were so wide that our entire family could hold hands around the trunk and still not encompass their girth. The forest floor was carpeted with thick layers of fallen needles that muffled our footsteps, creating an almost sacred silence broken only by the occasional bird call or rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Patricia's family had already arrived and settled into the cabin when we pulled up. The structure was rustic but comfortable, with a wraparound porch and large windows that offered stunning views of the surrounding forest. Patricia greeted us warmly, introducing her husband Carlos and their 2 children, 10-year-old Miguel and 8-year-old Isabella. Our camping setup was simple but effective. We pitched our large family tent about a 5-minute walk from the cabin, following a well-worn path that wound between the massive tree trunks. During daylight hours, the walk was pleasant and easy, with dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above and the gentle sounds of nature providing a soothing soundtrack. The first few days were perfect. We hiked along established trails, marveling at the diversity of plant life that thrived in the redwood ecosystem. We discovered hidden groves where the trees formed natural amphitheaters, and quiet streams where we could sit and listen to the water babbling over smooth stones. Uncle Roberto taught us how to identify different types of ferns and mushrooms, while Carmen shared stories about the Native American tribes who had called these forests home for thousands of years. Evenings were spent at the cabin, gathered around the dinner table sharing stories of our daily adventures. Patricia was an excellent cook, and she delighted in preparing elaborate meals that filled the cabin with the aromas of garlic, herbs, and home-cooked goodness. After dinner, we would play board games, share ghost stories, or simply sit on the porch listening to the night sounds of the forest. But as comfortable as I felt during those daylight hours, something about the nighttime transformation of the forest unsettled me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. When darkness fell, the friendly, majestic trees seemed to take on more sinister personalities. The familiar paths became obstacle courses of hidden roots and fallen branches. The sounds that had been comforting during the day, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the creaking of ancient wood, became mysterious and potentially threatening. Our flashlights created small circles of safety in an ocean of impenetrable darkness. Beyond their reach, the forest held secrets that my imagination filled with increasingly unsettling possibilities. Every shadow could hide watching eyes, every sound could signal approaching danger, and every step away from the cabin's warm lights felt like a journey into the unknown. By our fourth night in the redwoods, a comfortable routine had established itself. After dinner and evening activities at the cabin, our family would gather our belongings, check our flashlights, and make the short but increasingly nerve-wracking journey back to our tent. What should have been a simple 5-minute walk had become a nightly test of courage that I secretly dreaded. The ritual always began the same way. Carmen would announce that it was time to head back, and we would reluctantly gather our things. Roberto would double-check that our flashlights had fresh batteries, while Diego and Sofia would argue about who had to carry the heavier backpack. I would stand by the cabin door, looking out into the wall of darkness that seemed to press against the windows like a living thing. The moment we stepped off the cabin's porch, the temperature seemed to drop by 10 degrees. The warm yellow light from the windows would fade behind us with alarming speed, swallowed by the hungry darkness of the forest. Our flashlight beams would dance ahead of us, illuminating a constantly shifting landscape of massive tree trunks, fallen logs, and undergrowth that seemed to move just beyond the edge of our vision. Roberto always led our small procession, his confident stride and steady flashlight beam providing a sense of security. Carmen would follow closely behind him, often carrying Isabella when the young girl grew tired. Diego and Sofia usually walked together in the middle of our group, their whispered conversations and occasional nervous laughter helping to break the oppressive silence of the night forest. And then there was me, inevitably bringing up the rear. Despite my best efforts to keep pace with the others, I found myself falling behind night after night. Whether it was my natural tendency to observe my surroundings more carefully, or simply a subconscious reluctance to venture deeper into the darkness, I consistently found myself becoming separated from the group by several yards. This positioning made me acutely aware of everything happening around us as we walked. I noticed how our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, crushing dried needles and snapping small twigs with sounds that echoed through the trees. I observed how our flashlight beams created wildly dancing shadows that transformed familiar daytime landmarks into threatening, unrecognizable shapes. Most unsettling of all was the sensation that we were not alone in the forest. While I never saw anything concrete, I frequently had the distinct impression that something was watching our nightly procession. It was a feeling that started as a small itch between my shoulder blades and gradually spread throughout my body. The unmistakable sensation of being observed by hidden eyes. The forest itself seemed to respond to our presence in ways that I found increasingly disturbing. Sounds that had been constant during our passage would suddenly stop, as if the wildlife was holding its breath and waiting for us to pass. Then, moments after we had moved on, the normal forest noises would resume behind us, creating the unsettling impression that we were moving through a wave of unnatural silence. Our pathway wound between trees so massive that their trunks disappeared into darkness above and below our flashlight beams. These ancient giants created a maze-like environment where familiar landmarks were easily lost in the shadows. More than once I found myself momentarily disoriented, unsure whether we were still following the correct path or had somehow wandered into unexplored territory. The undergrowth on either side of our trail rustled constantly with the movements of unseen creatures. While logic told me these were probably just small mammals, birds, or insects going about their nocturnal business, my imagination populated the darkness with increasingly sinister possibilities. Every rustling bush could hide something watching us. Every snapping twig could signal the approach of something we couldn't see. Roberto tried to maintain a cheerful atmosphere during these nightly walks, pointing out interesting features visible in our flashlight beams or sharing facts about redwood ecology. But even his normally confident voice seemed smaller and less reassuring when surrounded by the vast darkness of the ancient forest. Carmen would occasionally call back to ensure that everyone was keeping up, her voice carrying a note of maternal concern that suggested she, too, felt the oppressive weight of the nighttime forest. As we walked, I found myself developing an almost obsessive habit of checking behind us. Every few steps, I would turn around and shine my flashlight back along the path we had just traveled, scanning for any signs of movement or watching eyes. These backward glances never revealed anything concrete, but they did nothing to alleviate the growing certainty that something was following us through the darkness. The trees themselves seemed to watch our progress with ancient, patient intelligence. Their massive forms loomed over us like silent sentinels, their bark deeply grooved and scarred by centuries of weather and growth. In the shifting light of our flashlights, these natural textures created faces and shapes that appeared to move and change as we passed. The fifth night began like all the others, but there was something different in the air. A tension that I couldn't quite identify but felt in every fiber of my being. Dinner at the cabin had been particularly enjoyable, with Patricia preparing her famous enchiladas and Carlos entertaining us with stories from his childhood in Mexico. The evening had stretched longer than usual, filled with laughter and animated conversation that made the inevitable return to our tent feel even more daunting. By the time Carmen announced it was time to head back, it was nearly 11 o'clock, later than we had ever started our nighttime journey. The darkness outside seemed deeper and more impenetrable than usual, pressing against the cabin windows with an almost aggressive intensity. When Roberto opened the door to check the weather, a rush of cold air swept into the warm cabin, carrying with it the scent of decomposing leaves and something else, something wild and animal-like that made my stomach clench with unease. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset, and our breath formed small clouds in the beam of our flashlights as we prepared for the walk. Carmen had packed an extra sweater in her bag, and she insisted that Sophia wear it despite the girls' protests that she wasn't cold. Roberto checked and rechecked our flashlights, replacing batteries in 2 of them even though they seemed to be working perfectly well. As we said our goodbyes to Patricia's family, I noticed that even they seemed reluctant to let us go. Carlos offered multiple times to drive us to our campsite, despite the fact that the path was far too narrow for any vehicle. Patricia suggested that we might want to consider sleeping on the cabin floor, an offer that Carmen politely declined, but I secretly wished she would accept. The moment we stepped off the cabin porch, I knew this night would be different from all the others. The usual sounds of the forest, the gentle rustling of leaves, the distant calls of night birds, the occasional scurrying of small animals, were completely absent. The redwood forest, normally alive with subtle sounds and movements, was wrapped in a silence so complete it felt almost artificial. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in this unnatural quiet, each step on the forest floor producing sounds that seemed to echo between the massive tree trunks. Roberto's usual commentary about forest features was replaced by tense silence, and even Diego and Sophia had stopped their normal chatter. We walked in a procession that felt more like a funeral march than a casual stroll to our campsite. As we moved deeper into the forest, I became increasingly aware that the normal arrangement of our group was being disrupted. Roberto was walking faster than usual, his flashlight beam sweeping nervously from side to side, as if searching for something he expected to find. Carmen was struggling to keep up with his pace, while also ensuring that the younger children didn't fall behind. Diego and Sophia, usually so confident and playful, had moved closer together and were walking in almost perfect synchronization, their small hands occasionally reaching out to touch each other for reassurance. Their whispered conversations had stopped entirely, replaced by tense breathing and the sound of their footsteps on the forest floor. And I, as always, found myself falling behind the group. But tonight, the distance between me and the others seemed to grow more rapidly than usual. Whether they were walking faster out of nervousness or I was walking slower out of an inexplicable reluctance to proceed, the gap between us widened with each step we took. The beam of my flashlight seemed weaker than usual, barely penetrating the thick darkness that surrounded us. The massive redwood trunks loomed like ancient guardians in the circle of light, their deeply grooved bark creating patterns that seemed to shift and move as my light played across them. Above us, the canopy was completely invisible, lost in a darkness so complete it felt like we were walking through an underground cavern rather than an open forest. Every few steps, I found myself stopping to listen, convinced that I had heard something moving in the underbrush beside our path. But each time I paused to focus on these sounds, the forest would fall into that unnatural silence, as if whatever I had heard was now motionless, waiting and watching. When I would finally move forward again, the sounds would resume just at the edge of my hearing, subtle rustlings and soft footfalls that seemed to match my own pace. The temperature continued to drop as we walked, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket and settling into my bones. My breath formed increasingly large clouds in the beam of my flashlight, and I began to shiver despite my layers of clothing. The cold seemed to be coming from the forest itself, radiating from the massive trees and the dark spaces between them. As the distance between me and the rest of my family continued to grow, I felt an increasing sense of isolation and vulnerability. Their flashlight beams were becoming smaller and more distant, reduced to flickering points of light that seemed to dance between the tree trunks ahead of me. Their voices, when I could hear them at all, sounded muffled and strange, as if the forest was absorbing and distorting the sound. It was in this state of growing unease and isolation that I first heard my name being called from the darkness behind me. The sound of my name cut through the oppressive silence of the forest like a knife through silk. It was soft at first, barely distinguishable from the subtle sounds of wind moving through the redwood canopy far above us. But as I stopped walking and strained to listen, I heard it again, clearer this time, and unmistakably calling my name. The voice was coming from somewhere behind me, back in the direction of the cabin we had left just minutes earlier. My first rational thought was that Patricia had discovered something we had forgotten, perhaps a phone charger or one of Sophia's stuffed animals, and was hurrying through the forest to return it to us. This explanation made perfect sense and should have provided immediate relief from the anxiety that had been building throughout our walk. But something about the voice didn't sound quite right, while it definitely seemed to be Patricia's voice. There was a quality to it that I couldn't immediately identify, but that made my stomach tighten with unease. It was as if her voice was being filtered through some kind of electronic device, or as if she was calling from a great distance despite sounding relatively close. I stopped walking completely and turned around, shining my flashlight back along the path we had just traveled. The beam illuminated the familiar landscape of massive tree trunks and forest undergrowth, but I couldn't see any sign of Patricia or anyone else who might have been following us. The pathway stretched back into darkness beyond the reach of my light, empty and silent except for the echo of my name still seeming to hang in the air. Ahead of me, my family continued walking, apparently unaware that I had stopped. The distance between us was now significant enough that their flashlight beams appeared as distant, flickering stars through the forest of tree trunks. I could still hear their footsteps and occasional conversation, but the sounds seemed muffled and far away, as if they were in a completely different part of the forest. I called out toward the darkness behind me, using Patricia's name and asking if everything was all right. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the silence of the forest, and it seemed to be absorbed by the massive trees without producing any echo or response. I waited for several seconds, listening intently for any reply, but heard nothing except the sound of my own breathing and the distant footsteps of my family moving further away. Then I heard my name again, more clearly this time, and definitely coming from somewhere in the darkness behind me. But now I was certain that something was wrong with the voice. While it still sounded like Patricia, there was a strange, hollow quality to it that reminded me of old audio recordings or voices heard through damaged speakers. The tone was also wrong, too flat, too emotionless, lacking the warmth and inflection that characterized Patricia's normal speech patterns. Despite these unsettling observations, the rational part of my mind continued to insist that Patricia must be trying to catch up with us for some perfectly innocent reason. Perhaps she was calling through cupped hands, which could account for the strange acoustic qualities I was noticing. Or maybe she was slightly out of breath from hurrying through the forest, which could explain the flat, strained tone of her voice. With these explanations providing some comfort, I decided to walk back toward the voice and see what Patricia needed. I called out to my family to let them know I would catch up with them in a moment, but they were now far enough away that I wasn't sure if they heard me. Their flashlight beams had disappeared entirely behind the forest of tree trunks, leaving me alone in my small circle of light. As I began walking back along the path, I heard my name called again, this time with what seemed like increased urgency. The voice was definitely closer now, but the strange, distorted quality was becoming more pronounced rather than less. It was beginning to sound less like Patricia calling through cupped hands and more like a recording of Patricia's voice being played through a damaged audio system. The forest around me seemed to respond to my change in direction in ways that I found increasingly disturbing. The oppressive silence that had characterized our entire walk was broken by new sounds. Subtle rustlings in the undergrowth, soft footfalls that seemed to match my own pace, and what sounded like branches being carefully moved aside by something large moving parallel to the path. My flashlight beam, which had seemed inadequate throughout our walk, now appeared to be growing weaker with each step I took away from my family. The circle of light around me was shrinking, making the massive redwood trunks seem to press closer and closer. The familiar pathway, which I had walked multiple times over the past few days, suddenly seemed foreign and threatening. As I continued walking toward the voice, I became increasingly aware that the normal sounds of a forest at night, the calls of nocturnal birds, the rustling of small mammals, the subtle sounds of insects, were completely absent. The redwood forest, which should have been alive with the activities of countless creatures, was wrapped in a silence so complete it felt almost supernatural. The cold was also becoming more intense, seeping through my jacket and settling into my bones despite the physical activity of walking. My breath formed increasingly large clouds in the beam of my flashlight, and I began to shiver uncontrollably. But this wasn't the normal cold of a forest night. It felt somehow wrong, as if it was coming from something other than the natural drop in temperature after sunset. When I heard my name called for the fourth time, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was calling me was not Patricia. The voice retained her vocal patterns and intonation, but it was now obviously artificial. A perfect imitation that was just slightly off in ways that my subconscious mind had been trying to warn me about from the very beginning. The moment I realized that the voice calling my name was not Patricia, every instinct in my body began screaming at me to run. But instead of fleeing, I found myself frozen in place, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand as I strained to peer into the darkness ahead. The voice had stopped calling, but I could sense a presence in the forest around me, something watching, waiting, and evaluating my next move. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't simply the absence of sound, but rather a complete void that seemed to absorb even the small noises I was making. My breathing, the rustling of my jacket, even the soft electrical hum of my flashlight. It was as if the forest itself had stopped functioning, suspended in a moment of unnatural stillness. But then, just at the edge of my hearing, I detected something that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was the sound of breathing. slow, deliberate, and definitely not human. The rhythm was wrong, too deep and too controlled, like something that was consciously trying to mimic human respiratory patterns, but couldn't quite manage the natural irregularity of unconscious breathing. I slowly moved my flashlight beam back and forth across the forest ahead of me, searching for the source of this unsettling sound. The light revealed the familiar landscape of massive redwood trunks and thick undergrowth. But everything seemed somehow different now. More threatening, more alive with malevolent possibility. Shadows that had been simple gaps between trees during our previous walks now appeared to writhe and shift, as if they were hiding something that didn't want to be seen. The breathing sound continued, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Sometimes it appeared to be directly ahead of me, sometimes to my left or right, and occasionally it seemed to be coming from above, as if something was perched in the lower branches of the massive trees. This shifting location made it impossible for me to focus my light on any specific area, and I found myself spinning slowly in place, trying to track a sound that seemed to move independently of any physical source. As I stood there turning in confused circles, I became aware of another disturbing phenomenon. The darkness beyond my flashlight beam wasn't simply the normal black of night in a dense forest. Instead, it seemed to have texture and depth, as if it was a physical substance that was actively resisting the penetration of my light. When I moved the beam away from an area and then quickly moved it back, I could swear that the darkness was flowing back into place like thick liquid. My name was called again, but this time the voice came from a completely different direction. Off to my right, where the forest floor sloped gently downward toward what I remembered being a small creek. But now the voice had changed in other ways as well. While it still maintained Patricia's basic vocal characteristics, it had taken on an urgent, almost desperate quality that was completely unlike her normal calm demeanor. The false urgency in the voice triggered something in my memory. A conversation I had overheard between Carmen and my mother before I left for California. They had been discussing local folklore and superstitions, and Carmen had mentioned something about entities that lived in remote wilderness areas and used imitated voices to lure people away from safety. At the time, I had dismissed it as typical adult superstition, but now those half-remembered warnings came flooding back with terrifying clarity. Understanding that I was dealing with something that was definitely not human, I began to back slowly toward where I hoped my family was still walking. But as I moved, I discovered that my sense of direction had become completely confused. The pathway that should have been directly behind me seemed to have disappeared, replaced by dense undergrowth that I couldn't remember seeing earlier. My flashlight beam revealed no clear trail in any direction, just an endless maze of tree trunks and shadowy spaces between them. The breathing sounds were getting closer now, and they were being joined by other noises that made my skin crawl with primitive terror. There was a soft scratching sound, like claws being dragged across bark, and occasional soft thuds that could have been footsteps, or something dropping from the trees above. Most disturbing of all was a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within the chest of something much larger than any animal I knew lived in these forests. As these sounds closed in around me, I caught my first glimpse of what had been calling my name. It was just a flash of movement in my peripheral vision, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. The shape was wrong. Too tall and thin, moving in ways that no human body could move, with proportions that suggested something that had learned to imitate human form, but had never quite mastered the details. When I turned my flashlight toward where I had seen the movement, I found nothing but empty forest. But now I could smell something that hadn't been there before. A wild animal scent mixed with something else that reminded me of old meat and wet fur. The odor was strong enough to make me gag, and it seemed to be getting stronger with each passing moment. My name was called one final time, but now the voice had dropped all pretense of being Patricia. It was still recognizably her vocal patterns, but distorted and wrong in ways that made it clear that whatever was producing the sound had never been human. The tone was hungry and predatory, filled with an alien intelligence that viewed me as prey rather than a person. That final, obviously inhuman call broke the spell of paralysis that had been holding me in place. Every survival instinct inherited from thousands of generations of human ancestors suddenly activated, flooding my system with adrenaline and an overwhelming compulsion to flee. Without conscious thought, I spun around and began running through the forest, crashing through undergrowth and bouncing off tree trunks in my desperate attempt to escape whatever was stalking me. Running through a redwood forest at night, while being pursued by something inhuman, is an experience that defies rational description. Every step was a leap of faith into darkness. Every shadow could hide a route that would send me tumbling, and every second that passed brought me closer to complete panic. My flashlight beam bobbed wildly as I ran, creating a strobe light effect that transformed the forest into a series of frozen snapshots. Tree trunk, undergrowth, more tree trunks, and always the impenetrable darkness just beyond my light. Behind me, I could hear sounds that confirmed my worst fears about what was following me. There were footsteps, but they didn't follow the regular rhythm of human running. Instead, they came in irregular patterns, sometimes rapid like a four-legged animal, sometimes slow and deliberate like something carefully choosing its footing, and occasionally stopping altogether as if the creature was pausing to track my scent or listen for my location. The sounds weren't limited to footsteps. I could hear branches being pushed aside with more force than any human would use, and occasionally there would be scratching sounds against tree bark that suggested claws rather than hands. Most terrifying of all were the breathing sounds, which had evolved from the artificial human-like pattern I had first noticed into something that was definitely animal but far too large and intelligent to be any creature I knew lived in these forests. As I crashed through the undergrowth, I tried desperately to remember the layout of the forest and find my way back to either the cabin or our campsite. But in my panic and the disorienting darkness, I had lost all sense of direction. The massive redwood trunks all looked identical in my wildly swinging flashlight beam, and the undergrowth between them seemed to have rearranged itself into configurations I didn't remember from our previous walks. My lungs were burning from the cold air and the exertion of running, and my legs were beginning to shake from the adrenaline and fear. But every time I considered slowing down or stopping to catch my breath, I would hear those pursuing sounds behind me and force myself to continue. Whatever was following me was persistent and patient, maintaining a steady distance that suggested it was playing with me rather than trying to catch me immediately. The forest itself seemed to be working against my escape. Roots appeared out of nowhere to catch my feet, branches hung at exactly the right height to slap against my face and chest, and the undergrowth seemed to grow thicker and more tangled with every step I took. My jacket was torn in several places from encounters with thorns and sharp branches, and I could feel scratches on my face and hands from the various obstacles I had crashed through. Most disturbing of all was the growing realization that the sounds behind me were becoming more coordinated and purposeful. What had started as random pursuit noises were organizing into patterns that suggested intelligence and strategy. The creature was learning my running patterns, anticipating my changes in direction, and gradually herding me away from any area where I might find help or safety. As this understanding dawned on me, I forced myself to stop running and listen carefully to what was happening around me. The immediate silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the sounds had been. Whatever was pursuing me had also stopped, and I could sense it somewhere in the darkness nearby, waiting and watching to see what I would do next. In the relative quiet, I could hear my own heart pounding and my labored breathing, but I could also detect something else, the distant sound of human voices calling my name. But these voices were different from the artificial imitation that had lured me away from my family. These were real human voices, filled with genuine concern and growing panic. Carmen, Roberto, and my cousins had realized I was missing and were searching for me. The relief I felt at hearing their voices was immediately tempered by a new fear, that whatever was stalking me might also hear them and turn its attention to my family. The creature had already demonstrated its ability to imitate human voices perfectly, and I realized that it might use this ability to lure my relatives into the same trap that had caught me. With this terrifying possibility in mind, I began moving as quietly as possible toward the sound of the real voices, trying to avoid making any noise that might alert the creature to my family's location. But as I crept through the forest, I became aware that the sounds of pursuit had resumed behind me. Whatever was following me was also moving toward the voices, staying just far enough behind me to remain hidden while using me to lead it to new prey. The next few minutes became a nightmare game of cat and mouse through the dark forest. I tried to move quickly enough to reach my family before the creature could catch either them or me, while also trying to move quietly enough to avoid leading it directly to them. Behind me, I could hear it matching my pace perfectly, sometimes stopping when I stopped, sometimes moving when I moved, always maintaining that perfect distance that kept it just beyond the reach of my flashlight. The voices of my family were getting closer, but they were also becoming more frantic. I could hear Carmen calling my name with increasing desperation, and Roberto shouting instructions to Diego and Sofia about staying close and keeping their flashlights pointed outward. They had clearly realized that something was seriously wrong, but they had no idea what kind of danger they were walking into. Just as I was beginning to think I might reach them safely, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was my own voice, calling out to Carmen from somewhere behind me and to my left. The imitation was perfect. Every inflection, every tone, even the slight breathlessness that would be natural if I had been running through the forest. But I was standing perfectly still, listening to something else use my voice to call to my aunt. The realization that the creature could imitate not just Patricia's voice, but my voice as well, filled me with a terror so complete that I nearly collapsed. If it could sound exactly like me, there was no way for my family to distinguish between the real me and the creature when we finally encountered each other. They might run toward the wrong voice. Or worse, they might not trust the real me when I tried to warn them about the danger. The sound of my own voice calling from the wrong direction galvanized me into action like nothing else could have. I abandoned all attempts at stealth and began running toward my family's voices, crashing through the underbrush and shouting warnings at the top of my lungs. My words came out in a panicked jumble, warnings about something following me, pleas for them to stay together, and desperate assurances that I was the real me, and not whatever was imitating my voice from the forest. Carmen's voice reached me first, cutting through my panic with the kind of authoritative tone that only mothers and aunts can produce in moments of crisis. She was shouting my name repeatedly, but she was also giving rapid instructions to Roberto and the children about forming a tight group and keeping their flashlights pointed outward in all directions. Her voice carried a level of fear that I had never heard from her before, but it was mixed with determination and protective fury that made it clear she would fight anything that threatened her family. When I finally crashed through a thicket of ferns and found myself in the circle of their combined flashlight beams, the relief was so overwhelming that I nearly collapsed. Carmen immediately grabbed me and pulled me into the center of their protective formation, while Roberto began rapidly examining me for injuries. Diego and Sofia pressed close against me, their small hands gripping my jacket as if they were afraid I might disappear again. But even as I felt the safety of being reunited with my family, I was acutely aware that we were far from out of danger. The sounds of pursuit that had been following me through the forest had not stopped when I reached the others. Instead, they had changed, becoming more cautious and circling around our position like a predator evaluating its prey. I could hear movement in the darkness beyond our flashlight beams, soft footfalls, rustling undergrowth, and that artificial breathing pattern that had first alerted me to the creature's inhuman nature. Roberto had taken charge of our group with military-like precision, positioning us in a tight formation with the children in the center and the adults facing outward with flashlights and the few improvised weapons he could quickly gather. A heavy walking stick, a large rock, and the camping knife from his belt. His voice was calm and controlled as he gave instructions. but I could see the fear in his eyes as he scanned the darkness around us. I tried to explain what had happened to me, but my words came out in fragmented bursts between gasps for air. I told them about the voice imitating Patricia, about the breathing sounds and the wrongness of everything I had encountered, and about the thing that had been pursuing me through the forest. As I spoke, I could see understanding and horror dawning in their faces, particularly in Carmen's eyes as she recognized elements of the folklore she had grown up with. "Skinwalker," she whispered, and the word seemed to carry physical weight in the darkness around us. Roberto nodded grimly, clearly familiar with the term and its implications. Even Diego and Sofia seemed to understand the significance of the word, their small bodies pressing even closer to the adults as their eyes darted nervously toward the shadows beyond our lights. As if responding to Carmen's identification, the sounds around us became more aggressive and purposeful. The creature, or creatures, as I was beginning to suspect there might be more than one, began calling to us in voices we recognized. First, it was Patricia's voice, asking if we had found me and offering to help search. Then it was Carlos's voice, claiming that they had been looking for us and asking us to follow his voice back to the cabin. Most disturbing of all was when it began using my voice again, calling from multiple directions simultaneously, and creating the impossible scenario of hearing myself speak from several different locations in the forest. The effect was disorienting and psychologically devastating, making it difficult for any of us to trust our own perceptions of what was real and what was artificial. Roberto made the decision that probably saved all our lives. Instead of trying to follow any of the voices or attempting to navigate back to familiar territory, he led us to the base of the largest redwood tree in our immediate vicinity. These ancient giants often had hollow spaces at their bases where centuries of weather and decay had carved out natural shelters. We squeezed into one of these hollows, positioning ourselves so that we could see out in all directions while having solid wood at our backs. The tree hollow provided both physical protection and psychological comfort. The massive redwood trunk was too large for any creature to climb easily, and the hollow was just large enough for our family to huddle together while still being able to defend the opening. Roberto positioned himself at the mouth of the hollow with his improvised weapons, while Carmen used her body to shield the children and kept her flashlight pointed outward. From our defensive position, we could observe the creature's behavior more safely. What we saw confirmed our worst fears about the intelligence and persistence of what we were dealing with. The sounds of movement around our hiding place became more systematic and methodical, suggesting that the creature was carefully examining our shelter and looking for weaknesses or alternative approaches. Occasionally, we would catch glimpses of movement in our flashlight beams, never long enough or clear enough to see exactly what we were dealing with, but sufficient to confirm that something large and wrong was circling our position. The shapes we saw were too tall and moved in ways that no known animal could move, with proportions that suggested something that had learned to imitate human form, but had never quite perfected the mimicry. The vocal imitations continued throughout the night, becoming increasingly sophisticated and psychologically targeted. The creature began using the voices of my parents, calling my name with exactly the inflections and emotional tones they would use if they were genuinely worried about me. It imitated my grandmother's voice, speaking in Spanish and using pet names that only she had ever called me. Most cruelly of all, it began using the voice of my younger sister, pleading for me to help her because she was lost and scared. The first hints of dawn came not as visible light, but as a gradual change in the quality of darkness around us. The absolute black of the forest night slowly began to differentiate into shades of gray, and the oppressive weight of complete darkness gradually lifted from our shoulders. With this subtle change came an equally gradual cessation of the sounds that had terrorized us throughout the night. The creature's vocal imitations became less frequent and less convincing as the darkness faded. It was as if the approaching daylight was somehow weakening its power or confidence, forcing it to retreat to whatever hidden spaces it occupied during daylight hours. The last voice we heard was a perfect imitation of my mother calling my name, but it came from such a great distance that it sounded more like a final threat than an immediate danger. As full daylight finally penetrated the forest canopy, we cautiously emerged from our hiding place in the hollow of the massive redwood. Roberto led our small group with even more caution than he had shown during our nighttime terror, constantly scanning the forest around us and insisting that we maintain our tight formation even in the apparent safety of daylight. The forest looked completely different in the morning light. The massive trees that had seemed threatening and maze-like in the darkness were revealed to be familiar landmarks that we had passed many times during our previous walks. The undergrowth that had appeared dense and impenetrable in our flashlight beams was actually fairly sparse and easy to navigate. Most remarkably of all, we discovered that we were less than 100 yards from our campsite, having spent the entire night practically within sight of our tent. But even in the comforting light of day, there were signs of the previous night's encounter that couldn't be explained away as imagination or fear-induced hallucinations. The forest floor around our hiding place was marked with tracks unlike anything any of us had ever seen. They were roughly human-shaped but far too large, with claw marks instead of normal toe impressions and a gait pattern that suggested something that moved on two legs, but wasn't quite comfortable with bipedal locomotion. More disturbing were the scratch marks on several of the trees surrounding our overnight shelter. These gouges in the bark were too high and too deep to have been made by any known animal, and they formed patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random animal behavior. Some of the marks appeared to be symbols or pictographs, crude but purposeful scratches that conveyed meaning in some alien language. When we finally made it back to the cabin, Patricia and Carlos were awake and preparing breakfast, completely unaware of the terror we had experienced during the night. Their casual morning routine and cheerful greetings seemed surreal after what we had been through, and it took several minutes for us to find the words to explain why we looked like we had been through a battle. Patricia's reaction to our story was immediate and chilling. She didn't express skepticism or suggest alternative explanations for our experience. Instead, her face went pale, and she began rapidly packing their belongings, insisting that both families needed to leave the forest immediately. When Roberto asked why she was so certain about the danger, she revealed that she had grown up in an area where encounters with skinwalkers were part of local folklore and family history. According to Patricia, skinwalkers were malevolent entities that inhabited remote wilderness areas and possessed the ability to perfectly imitate human voices and appearance. They used these abilities to lure people away from safety, either to feed on them or to steal their identities and infiltrate human communities. Most importantly, she explained that they were primarily nocturnal creatures that became significantly less powerful and more vulnerable during daylight hours. The revelation that skinwalkers were real, documented threats rather than mere folklore sent chills through our entire group. Patricia's matter-of-fact discussion of their habits and vulnerabilities made it clear that we had been incredibly fortunate to survive our encounter. According to her family's traditions, skinwalkers typically didn't give up after a single failed hunt, and they were known to follow potential prey for days or even weeks, waiting for another opportunity to isolate and attack them. Within 2 hours of sunrise, both families had packed all our belongings and were driving away from the redwood forest. As we put distance between ourselves and the scene of our terrifying encounter, I found myself looking back through the car windows at the massive trees that had hidden such an ancient and malevolent presence. The forest looked peaceful and beautiful in the morning sunlight, giving no hint of the horrors that emerged after dark. But even as we drove toward safety and civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of the forest. It was nothing concrete, no voices calling my name, no visible signs of pursuit, just an persistent sense that we were still being watched and evaluated by intelligences that viewed humans as prey rather than people. The drive back to Carmen and Roberto's house was conducted in relative silence, with all of us processing the reality of what we had experienced. The comfortable skepticism that allows most people to dismiss supernatural encounters as imagination or misperception had been completely shattered by our night in the redwood forest. We had come face to face with something that existed outside the boundaries of normal human experience, and that knowledge would change all of us permanently. Patricia's family left for their own home that same afternoon, but not before she had shared additional information about skinwalker encounters and protection methods. She gave us small pouches of sage and other herbs that were traditionally used to ward off malevolent spirits, and she taught us prayers and protective rituals that her grandmother had passed down through generations of women who lived in areas where such creatures were known to exist. As I write this account several years later, I still carry one of those herb pouches with me wherever I travel. And while I have never had another encounter with a skinwalker, I have never again taken for granted the safety of familiar places or the reliability of familiar voices calling from the darkness. The forest taught me that the world contains intelligences and malevolent forces that exist entirely outside human understanding, and that knowledge has made me both more cautious and more grateful for the simple safety of home and family. The redwood forest continues to draw millions of visitors each year, and most of them experience nothing more threatening than mosquito bites and sore feet. But I know that when darkness falls among those ancient trees, other things emerge to hunt and stalk and wait for the unwary traveler who strays too far from the safety of human companionship. And sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed in my safe suburban home, I can still hear my name being called by voices that sound like people I love but contain nothing human behind their perfect mimicry. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:45 a.m. on that crisp April morning in 2019. At 17, I had grown accustomed to these early starts, but something felt different as I pulled on my worn jeans and flannel shirt. The air held an unusual stillness that made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't yet understand. Our ranch sits 45 minutes east of Merritt, surrounded by the rolling grasslands that define this part of the British Columbia interior. During summer months, these fields come alive with grazing cattle, but in April, the landscape maintains an almost otherworldly quiet. The morning air bit at my cheeks as I stepped outside, my breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the thin atmosphere. Dad was already loading the horses into the trailer, his movements efficient despite the early hour. Rex, our border collie mix, paced nervously around the vehicles, his usual enthusiasm replaced by an odd restlessness that should have served as our first warning. The dog kept looking toward the mountains with his ears pinned back, a behavior I had never witnessed before in all our years of cattle drives. "You ready for this, son?" Dad asked, though his voice carried an undertone I couldn't identify. He had been moving cattle through these mountains for over 20 years, and his experience showed in every deliberate action. Yet something in his demeanor suggested an unease that matched my own growing apprehension. The drive to our starting point took us along Highway 5, past familiar landmarks that looked somehow foreign in the gray pre-dawn light. The mountains loomed ahead of us, their peaks obscured by low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down with an almost physical weight. As we turned off the highway onto the access road, the pavement gave way to gravel, and then to the rough dirt track that would take us up into the higher elevations where the cattle would spend their summer months. I've always found something magical about these early morning hours. The way the first light creeps across the landscape, painting everything in soft pastels before the harsh reality of full daylight takes over. But that morning, the approaching dawn felt ominous rather than beautiful. The shadows seemed darker, more substantial, as if they were hiding secrets that daylight couldn't fully reveal. We reached the cattle gathering point just as the sky began to lighten from black to deep purple. The animals were already restless, their usual docile nature replaced by a skittishness that made them difficult to manage. Several times the entire herd would suddenly shift direction for no apparent reason, as if responding to some signal that Dad and I couldn't perceive. "They're acting strange today," I commented, watching as a dozen heads suddenly bolted toward the fence line before stopping just as abruptly. Dad nodded grimly. "Animals know things we don't," he replied, his eyes scanning the tree line with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. They can sense danger long before we even realize it's there. The words hung in the air like a physical presence as we began the slow process of moving the herd up the mountain. Rex continued his nervous pacing, occasionally letting out small whimpers that seemed to echo strangely in the thin air. Every few minutes, he would stop completely and stare into the forest with such focus that I found myself following his gaze, searching for whatever had captured his attention. As we climbed higher, the paved road deteriorated into the rough mountain track I knew so well. But even this familiar route felt alien that morning. The usual sounds of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant sound of water flowing over rocks, were conspicuously absent. Instead, there was only the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the occasional creak of leather as Dad shifted in his saddle. The silence pressed against us like a living thing, making every small sound seem amplified and threatening. When a pine cone fell from a tree and hit the ground nearby, both Dad and I jumped as if we had heard gunfire. Rex's ears would perk up at random intervals, responding to sounds that remained beyond our human perception. "How much further to the gate?" I asked, though I knew the answer. The question came from a need to break the oppressive quiet rather than any real uncertainty about our destination. "Another mile, maybe 2, Dad replied, but his voice was tight with a tension that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "We'll push them through to the grazing area and then head back. Should be an easy day." As the words left his mouth, a sound drifted through the trees that made my blood freeze in my veins. It was distant and indistinct, but unmistakably unnatural. Not quite animal, not quite human, but something that fell uncomfortably between the two. Rex immediately began growling, his hackles raised as he turned toward the source of the sound. The cattle responded instantly, clustering together in a tight group with their heads raised and nostrils flaring. Several of the older cows began making low, distressed sounds that I had never heard before. The horses grew increasingly difficult to control, fighting the reins and trying to turn back down the mountain. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though the words seemed to carry farther than they should have in the still air. Dad's face had gone pale beneath his weathered tan. "Keep the cattle moving," he said quietly. "Don't look back. Don't stop. Just keep them moving forward." But as we continued up the mountain track, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Not watching from a distance, but actively tracking our progress through the forest. The sensation of being observed grew stronger with each step, until it became almost unbearable. The forest closed around us like a living trap as we pushed deeper into the mountain wilderness. What had started as a routine cattle drive was transforming into something far more sinister with each passing minute. The trees seemed to lean inward, creating a tunnel of shadows that swallowed the weak morning light and left us moving through a perpetual twilight. Rex's behavior had become increasingly erratic. The dog that usually ran alongside the cattle with boundless energy now stayed close to the horses, his body pressed low to the ground in a submissive posture I had never seen him adopt. Every few yards, he would stop completely and stare into the dense undergrowth to our left, away from the highway. His growls had become more frequent and more urgent, building to a crescendo before suddenly cutting off as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence that followed these growling episodes was what truly unnerved me. In all my years of working in these mountains, I had never experienced such complete absence of natural sound. There should have been dozens of bird species calling from the canopy above us. Squirrels should have been chattering and scampering through the branches. The forest should have been alive with the small sounds of countless creatures going about their daily routines. Instead, there was nothing. Nothing except the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth and the occasional creak of saddle leather. Even our breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath in anticipation of some terrible event. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's wrong with the forest?" He didn't answer immediately, but I saw his hand move unconsciously to the rifle secured to his saddle. The gesture was subtle, but it sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through my system. In all our years of working together, I had never seen him display such obvious concern about our safety in these familiar woods. The cattle were becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Animals that normally moved docilely up the mountain were now constantly trying to turn back toward the highway. Several times the entire herd attempted to bolt as a unit, requiring Rex and both horses to work frantically to keep them moving in the right direction. Their eyes showed white around the edges, and many of them were producing the stressed vocalizations that cattle make when they sense immediate danger. As we climbed higher, the vegetation began to change. The mixed forest of pine and aspen gave way to denser stands of spruce and fir, their branches interlocking overhead to create an almost impenetrable canopy. The path narrowed considerably, forcing the cattle into a single-file line that stretched out behind us like a living chain. This formation made them even more vulnerable and increased their obvious anxiety. "There's the gate," Dad said, pointing ahead to where a wooden structure was barely visible through the trees. But his voice carried no relief, only a grim determination to complete the task at hand. The gate marked the boundary between the lower mountain slopes where we maintained some level of control and the vast wilderness area where the cattle would spend their summer months. Beyond this point, the animals would be largely on their own, free to roam across thousands of acres of mountain meadows and alpine forest. Under normal circumstances, this transition represented the successful completion of our work. But nothing about this morning qualified as normal circumstances. As we approached the gate, Rex suddenly began barking with an intensity that made my heart race. Not the playful bark he used during routine cattle work, but a series of sharp, urgent sounds that spoke of genuine alarm. He was staring fixedly at a point approximately 50 yards to our left, where the forest grew particularly dense. The cattle reacted immediately to the dog's distress. The entire herd bunched together in a tight cluster, facing outward like a defensive formation. Several of the bulls began pawing the ground and snorting, their massive heads swinging back and forth as they searched for the source of danger. The horses began prancing nervously, fighting against our attempts to keep them calm. "Easy, Rex," Dad commanded, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "What is it, boy?" The dog continued his frantic barking for another 30 seconds before suddenly falling silent. The abrupt cessation of sound was more frightening than the barking had been. Rex remained in his alert position, muscles tensed and ready to flee, but his vocalizations stopped as if someone had given him a command we couldn't hear. In the silence that followed, I became aware of a new sound. It was subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from the natural settling sounds of the forest. But as I focused my attention, it resolved into something that made my skin crawl with primal fear. It sounded like footsteps, but not quite human footsteps. The rhythm was wrong, the spacing irregular, and there was a quality to the sound that suggested something much larger and heavier than any person. The footsteps seemed to be moving parallel to our route, staying hidden in the dense forest but matching our pace exactly. Sometimes they would fall behind, forcing us to wonder if we had imagined them entirely. Then they would surge ahead, always staying just beyond the range of our vision but close enough to remind us of their presence. "Dad," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. "Something's following us." He nodded grimly. "I know. Just keep the cattle moving. We need to get through that gate and get them settled. Then we'll figure out what to do next." But even as he spoke, I could see the doubt in his eyes. This was his mountain, his territory, and he had never encountered anything like what we were experiencing. The confidence that came from decades of experience was being replaced by the kind of fear that comes from confronting the unknown. As we reached the gate, I dismounted to open it, my hands shaking as I worked the latch mechanism. The metal was cold against my palms, and I noticed that my fingers left visible moisture marks on the steel surface. My body was producing adrenaline at a rate that left me feeling simultaneously hyper-alert and nauseated. The cattle moved through the gate with obvious reluctance, constantly looking back over their shoulders as if expecting pursuit. Even after we had driven them a considerable distance beyond the boundary, they remained clustered together rather than spreading out to graze as they normally would. "There's the pond," Dad said, pointing to a small body of water that served as a natural resting point during the cattle drive. "We'll let them drink and catch our breath." But as we approached the familiar landmark, I realized that our troubles were far from over. In fact, they were just beginning. The pond sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering spruce trees, their dark branches creating a cathedral-like space that normally felt peaceful and secure. But as our small convoy of cattle, horses, and humans entered this familiar sanctuary, the oppressive atmosphere that had been building throughout the morning reached a new level of intensity. The cattle immediately spread out around the water's edge, their heads dropping to drink with the desperate urgency of animals who sensed their time might be limited. But even as they satisfied their thirst, they remained alert, ears constantly moving and eyes darting toward the surrounding forest. Several of the older cows positioned themselves between the pond and the tree line, as if trying to shield the younger animals from some perceived threat. Dad and I dismounted near the center of the clearing, ostensibly to rest our horses and enjoy the spectacular view that opened up beyond the pond. From this elevation, we could see across the valley to the Cascade Mountain Range, with its snow-capped peaks gleaming in the morning sunlight. Closer to us, Stajama Mountain rose from the forest like a green sentinel, its slopes covered in the dense coniferous growth that characterized this region. But the beauty of the landscape was overshadowed by the growing sense that we were being observed. The feeling had intensified during our climb to the pond, evolving from a vague unease to a certainty that hostile eyes were tracking our every movement. Rex remained pressed against my legs, his usual enthusiasm for exploring new territory completely absent. "Look at that view," Dad said, but his words sounded forced, as if he was trying to convince himself that everything was normal. "Never gets old, does it?" I nodded, but my attention was focused on the tree line below us. The clearing was positioned on a natural terrace, with the forest floor dropping away sharply on three sides. From our vantage point, we could see down into the canopy for several hundred feet, watching the tops of the trees sway gently in the mountain breeze. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a glimpse of movement in the shadows between the trees, roughly 500 feet below our position. My brain initially processed it as a large animal, a bear, perhaps, or an elk, moving through the underbrush. But as I focused my attention on the spot, what I saw made my mouth go dry with terror. The shape was moving upright, walking on two legs with a gait that was disturbingly human-like yet fundamentally wrong. It was too tall, too broad through the shoulders, and it moved with a fluid grace that no human could match in such difficult terrain. Even from this distance, I could tell that whatever I was looking at was massive, easily 7 feet tall or more. "Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Look down there, at about 2 o'clock from that dead snag." He followed my gaze, and I watched his face drain of color as he spotted the same figure that had captured my attention. For several seconds, we both stood frozen, trying to process what we were seeing. The creature, for lack of a better word, continued its methodical progress through the forest, apparently unaware that it was being observed. "Is that a person?" I asked, though my brain was already rejecting that possibility. Dad shook his head slowly. "No person I've ever seen," he replied, his voice tight with concern. "And no person should be in this area anyway. This is private land, posted against trespass." The implications of that statement hit me immediately. Just the week before, Dad and his crew had discovered evidence of illegal activity on the ranch. Tire tracks and equipment that suggested people were accessing the land without permission to engage in activities that could damage the grazing areas. The presence of an unauthorized individual in such a remote location raised the possibility that we were dealing with something much more dangerous than wildlife. "I'm going down there to check it out," Dad said, swinging back into his saddle. "You stay here with the cattle and make sure they don't scatter." "Dad, wait." I started to protest, but he was already spurring his horse toward the trail that led down into the forest. I watched him disappear into the trees, leaving me alone in the clearing with 30 head of increasingly agitated cattle and a dog that seemed to be on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. The minutes stretched like hours as I waited for Dad's return. The cattle had finished drinking but showed no inclination to spread out and begin grazing. Instead, they remained clustered in a tight group near the center of the clearing, their attention focused on the tree line where Dad had disappeared. Rex had stopped whimpering but remained pressed against my legs, trembling with tension. The silence of the forest was now complete. Not even the whisper of wind through the branches disturbed the oppressive quiet. It was as if the entire mountain ecosystem had shut down, waiting for some terrible event to unfold. The normal sounds of life, insects buzzing, birds calling, small animals moving through the underbrush, had vanished entirely. When Dad finally reappeared, his face was white with shock and his hands were shaking as he guided his horse back up the slope. The confident rancher who had descended into the forest 20 minutes earlier had been replaced by a man who looked as if he had seen something that challenged his understanding of the natural world. "What did you find?" I called out as he approached, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. He dismounted near where I was standing and looked around the clearing as if seeing it for the first time. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, as if he was afraid that speaking too loudly might attract unwanted attention. "Son," he said, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my stomach clench. "That isn't a person." The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I felt my world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath my feet had suddenly become unstable. Everything I thought I knew about these familiar mountains was being challenged by an encounter that defied rational explanation. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me was already beginning to understand. Before Dad could answer, a sound echoed through the forest that made both of us freeze in terror. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but quickly escalated into something that sounded like a massive tree falling. The crash seemed to go on forever, accompanied by the sound of breaking branches and disturbed wildlife. But what followed the crash was even more disturbing. In the sudden silence that followed, we could hear something moving through the forest with deliberate purpose. Not the random movements of a falling tree settling into place, but the organized sounds of something large and powerful making its way through the dense underbrush. Rex began whimpering again, a sound that cut through me like a knife. The cattle moved even closer together, forming a defensive circle that spoke to instincts developed over thousands of years of evolution. And in that moment, I realized that we were no longer the dominant predators in this environment. We had become prey. The crash that echoed through the forest marked a turning point in our mountain ordeal. What had been an unsettling morning of strange sounds and eerie sensations suddenly transformed into something far more immediate and threatening. The deliberate sounds of movement that followed the crash left no doubt that whatever we were dealing with was actively aware of our presence and was taking steps to respond to it. "We need to leave," Dad said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a command decision. "Right now. Get mounted and let's get these cattle moving." I swung back into my saddle with movements that felt clumsy and uncertain. My hands were shaking badly enough that it took 3 attempts to get my reins properly arranged, and I could feel cold sweat running down my back despite the cool mountain air. Rex leaped onto my horse behind the saddle, something he had never done before in all our years of working together. The cattle responded to our urgency with a level of cooperation that was almost supernatural. Animals that had been skittish and difficult to manage throughout the morning suddenly fell into formation as if they understood that their survival depended on following our lead. The entire herd moved as a single organism, flowing across the clearing toward the trail that would take us back toward civilization. But as we reached the edge of the clearing, I made the mistake of looking back toward the forest where Dad had made his disturbing discovery. What I saw made me question my own sanity and left me with images that would haunt my dreams for months to come. A massive pine tree, easily 4 feet in diameter and over 100 feet tall, lay stretched across the forest floor where it had been standing upright just minutes before. The tree appeared to have been pushed over rather than falling naturally, as evidenced by the way its root system had been torn from the earth in a pattern that defied explanation. Fresh earth still clung to the exposed roots, and several smaller trees had been crushed beneath its massive trunk. But what truly terrified me was the movement I could see in the shadows beyond the fallen giant. Dark shapes flitted between the standing trees with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for creatures of such apparent size. They moved in coordinated patterns, as if communicating with each other through some method beyond human understanding. "Don't look back," Dad commanded, but his own voice betrayed the fact that he too was stealing glances over his shoulder. "Just keep moving. We need to get to familiar ground." The trail leading away from the pond was narrow and winding, forcing us to move in single file with the cattle strung out in a long line behind us. This formation made us vulnerable and increased the animals' obvious anxiety. Several times, the entire herd tried to break into a run, requiring both horses and Rex to work frantically to maintain control. As we descended through the forest, the oppressive silence that had characterized the morning gave way to a different kind of quiet. This wasn't the absence of natural sound, but rather the hushed expectancy that precedes a storm. Even the rhythm of hooves on the packed earth seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing the sound of our passage. Rex's behavior had become increasingly frantic. The dog that usually ran alongside the cattle was now riding behind my saddle, pressed against my back with his entire body trembling. Every few minutes he would let out a small whimper and look back the way we had come, his ears flattened against his head in an expression of pure terror. "How much further to the gate?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "Maybe half a mile," Dad replied, but his voice was tight with uncertainty. "The trail gets rougher from here, and there are several places where we'll be exposed if anything decides to follow us." As if summoned by his words, a sound drifted through the trees that made my blood freeze. It was similar to the noise we had heard earlier in the morning, but much closer and more distinct. The sound seemed to combine elements of different animals: the deep rumble of a large predator, the higher pitch of something in distress, and an underlying quality that was disturbingly human-like. The cattle reacted instantly, bunching together in a panic that threatened to turn into a full stampede. Several of the younger animals broke from the group and tried to run back up the mountain, forcing Dad to spur his horse after them while shouting commands that seemed to have little effect. "Stay with the main herd," he called to me as he disappeared into the trees in pursuit of the fleeing cattle. "Keep them moving toward the gate." Being left alone with the remaining animals in such circumstances was terrifying beyond description. The sounds from the forest were becoming more frequent and seemed to be coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Whatever was out there wasn't operating alone. There were at least two, possibly more, of these creatures coordinating their movements in ways that suggested intelligence far beyond what I had expected. Rex jumped down from behind my saddle and began herding the cattle with a desperation I had never seen in him before. The dog seemed to understand that our lives might depend on keeping the animals together and moving in the right direction. His usual playful approach to cattle work had been replaced by a grim efficiency that spoke to his recognition of the danger we faced. The minutes dragged by like hours as I waited for Dad's return. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide potential threats, and every small sound, a branch creaking in the wind, a pine cone falling to the forest floor, sent fresh waves of adrenaline coursing through my system. My heart was beating so hard that I could feel it in my throat, and my hands had cramped from gripping the reins too tightly. When Dad finally reappeared with the missing cattle, his face was even paler than before. The confident rancher I had known all my life was being replaced by someone I didn't recognize, someone who had been forced to confront the reality that there were things in these mountains that fell outside his considerable experience and expertise. "We need to move faster," he said as he rejoined the main group. "I saw tracks down there that don't match anything I've ever seen before." "What kind of tracks?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Large, bipedal, but not human," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And fresh. Very fresh." As we continued down the mountain, I became aware that the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. The creatures, whatever they were, seemed to be pacing us, staying just out of sight but close enough to remind us of their presence. Sometimes the sounds would fall behind, giving us hope that we had outdistanced our pursuers. Then they would surge ahead, always staying just beyond the range of our vision but close enough to maintain the psychological pressure. The cattle were now in a constant state of near panic, requiring every bit of skill that Dad, Rex, and I possessed to keep them moving in the right direction. Several times, individual animals tried to break away from the group, forcing one of us to pursue them while the others struggled to maintain control of the main herd. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I saw something that made my heart leap with relief. There, maybe 200 yards ahead, was the gate that marked the boundary between the wilderness area and the more controlled environment of the lower mountain slopes. Beyond that gate lay the familiar territory of our ranch and the illusion of safety that came with known ground. But as we approached our destination, the sounds from the forest intensified dramatically. What had been occasional noises became a constant chorus of movement and communication that seemed to emanate from all directions simultaneously. Whatever was tracking us was closing in for what I could only assume would be some kind of confrontation. "Almost there," Dad said, but his voice carried more hope than confidence. "Just keep them moving." As we pushed the last of the cattle through the gate and secured it behind us, I thought our ordeal might finally be over. But as we would soon discover, our mysterious pursuers were far from finished with us. The relief I felt upon reaching the gate and securing it behind us proved to be short-lived. As we began the descent down the mountain path that would eventually lead us back to the ranch, it became increasingly clear that passing through the gate had not ended our encounter with whatever inhabited the deeper wilderness areas. If anything, our mysterious pursuers seemed to have become more active and more aggressive in their behavior. The trail leading down from the gate was one I had traveled countless times over the years. It wound through a mixed forest of aspen and pine, with occasional clearings that provided spectacular views of the valley below. Under normal circumstances, this portion of the journey home was one of my favorites, offering a chance to relax and enjoy the scenery after the hard work of moving cattle to their summer pasture. But nothing about this morning qualified as normal circumstances. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized our climb into the mountains had followed us back down, creating a sense of impending doom that made even familiar landmarks seem foreign and threatening. The cattle remained clustered together in an unnatural formation, their usual tendency to spread out and graze completely suppressed by their obvious fear. Rex had resumed his position running alongside the horses, but his behavior remained far from normal. Every few minutes he would stop abruptly and stare back up the mountain, his hackles raised and his body tense with anticipation. The dog's distress was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, particularly since his instincts had proven so reliable throughout the morning's events. "Look at that," Dad said suddenly, pulling his horse to a stop and pointing toward a large pine tree that stood beside the trail. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop as I saw what had captured his attention. The tree, which I remembered as unmarked during our passage earlier that morning, now bore a series of deep gashes that ran from roughly 7 feet above the ground down to about 4 feet from the base. The marks appeared fresh, with sap still seeping from the wounds in the bark. But what made these marks truly disturbing was their pattern and depth. They weren't random scratches left by a bear or other large animal. Instead, they formed a deliberate design that looked almost like some kind of primitive communication. 4 parallel lines ran vertically down the trunk, intersected by 2 horizontal lines that created a pattern resembling a crude grid or map. "Those weren't there this morning," I said, though the statement was unnecessary. Both Dad and I had excellent memories for trail conditions, and such obvious markings would never have escaped our notice during the upward journey. Dad dismounted and approached the tree for a closer examination. As he drew near, I could see his face growing increasingly pale as he took in the full extent of the damage. The gouges were deep enough to penetrate several inches into the heartwood, and they had been made with tremendous force. Whatever had created these marks possessed strength far beyond that of any normal forest animal. "Look at the spacing," he said, running his finger along the edge of one of the vertical marks. "These lines are about 6 inches apart, which would suggest fingers or claws of considerable size. But the depth and precision suggest tool use rather than natural weapons." The implications of his observation sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through my system. We were dealing with something that possessed not only size and strength, but also intelligence and the ability to manipulate its environment in deliberate ways. The marks on the tree weren't random damage. They were a message. As we remounted and continued down the trail, I found myself scanning every tree we passed for similar markings. The forest that had seemed so familiar just hours earlier now felt like enemy territory, full of potential threats and hidden dangers. Every shadow between the trees could conceal watching eyes, and every sound, no matter how innocent, seemed to carry sinister implications. The cattle sensed our growing anxiety and responded by becoming even more difficult to manage. Several times the entire herd tried to break into a run, forcing Rex to work frantically to keep them together. The animals' eyes showed white around the edges, and many of them were producing stress vocalizations that I had never heard before in all my years of ranch work. "There's another one," I called out, pointing to a second marked tree roughly 50 yards further down the trail. This tree bore a different pattern of marks, 3 vertical lines crossed by a single horizontal slash, all carved with the same precision and depth as the first set. The message, whatever it was intended to convey, was being reinforced through repetition and variation. As we continued our descent, we discovered that virtually every large tree along our route had been marked in some way. Some bore the simple grid pattern we had first observed. Others showed more complex designs that seemed to incorporate elements of primitive pictographs. All of the marks appeared fresh, created within the past few hours while we had been moving cattle in the higher elevations. "They're marking territory," Dad said grimly, letting us know that this area is under their control. The realization that we were traveling through territory that had been claimed by unknown creatures was deeply unsettling. These mountains had been in our family for 3 generations, and Dad had been working cattle through these trails for over 2 decades. The idea that something else considered this area to be their domain challenged our most basic assumptions about the natural order. As we approached a familiar fork in the trail, where one path led back toward the ranch, while the other continued up toward the higher peaks, Rex suddenly began barking with an intensity that made my heart race. His attention was focused on the path that led upward, and his body language suggested the presence of immediate danger. Following the dog's gaze, I saw movement in the shadows between the trees roughly 100 yards up the alternate trail. The shapes were indistinct but clearly large, and they were moving with the same coordinated precision we had observed earlier in the morning. Whatever these creatures were, they had positioned themselves to observe our passage and were making no effort to conceal their presence. "They're watching us," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Dad nodded grimly. "They've been watching us all morning. The question is what they plan to do about it." As if in response to his words, a sound echoed through the forest that made both of us freeze in terror. It was similar to the vocalizations we had heard earlier, but much closer and more intense. The sound seemed to combine the hunting call of a large predator with something that was disturbingly human-like in its intonation and phrasing. The cattle reacted immediately, clustering together in a defensive formation that spoke to instincts developed over millions of years of evolution. Several of the bulls began pawing the ground and snorting, their massive heads swinging back and forth as they searched for the source of the threat. But what happened next was even more disturbing than the sound itself. From somewhere up the mountain came an answering call, different in tone but clearly part of the same communication system. Then another, from a different direction entirely. Within seconds, the forest was filled with a chorus of these unnatural vocalizations, creating a symphony of sound that seemed to surround us completely. "There's more than one," Dad said, his voice tight with fear. "There's a whole group of them." The realization that we were outnumbered by creatures of unknown capabilities and intentions was terrifying beyond description. These mountains that I had considered my home territory were now revealed to be the domain of something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. As the vocalizations faded into silence, we heard a new sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and definitely not human, were approaching through the forest from multiple directions. Whatever these creatures were, they were closing in on our position. "We need to get out of here," Dad said, spurring his horse toward the trail that led back to the ranch. "Right now." But as we began our desperate retreat, I couldn't shake the feeling that running away would only delay the inevitable. Whatever lived in these mountains had marked their territory, and we had trespassed in ways that demanded a response. The chase that followed would test our survival skills to their absolute limits. The decision to flee down the mountain trail seemed like our only option, but as we spurred our horses into a faster pace, it became clear that we were being herded rather than simply pursued. Every time we tried to take a direct route back toward the ranch, sounds would emerge from the forest ahead of us, forcing us to alter our course and take increasingly circuitous paths through terrain that was becoming less and less familiar. The cattle, responding to our obvious panic, had broken into the kind of desperate run that could injure animals and riders alike on such rough terrain. Rex was working frantically to keep the herd together, but even his exceptional skills were being tested by the chaos of our retreat. Several times, individual animals broke away from the group and had to be pursued through dense underbrush that tore at our clothes and scratched our faces. "They're driving us toward the upper trail," Dad shouted over the sound of hooves and heavy breathing. "We can't go back the way we came." The upper trail was a rough path that followed the ridgeline for several miles before descending toward the ranch through a series of switchbacks that were difficult to navigate under the best of circumstances. Taking that route would add hours to our journey and force us to travel through some of the most remote and exposed terrain in the entire area. But as sounds continued to emerge from the forest on both sides of our intended route, it became clear that we had no choice. Whatever was pursuing us had effectively cut off our escape routes and was forcing us to take the path that led deeper into their territory rather than toward the safety of civilization. The upper trail began with a steep climb that left our horses blowing hard within the first few hundred yards. The cattle were struggling even more, their sides heaving as they fought to maintain the pace we were demanding. Several of the older animals were beginning to show signs of exhaustion that could lead to collapse if we didn't slow down soon. "We have to rest them," I called to Dad, though the words felt like an admission of defeat. He nodded grimly and signaled for a halt near a small clearing that offered some visibility in all directions. The cattle immediately spread out and began the heavy breathing that indicated severe stress, while our horses stood with their heads hanging and their flanks covered in sweat. But our rest was interrupted by a sound that made every animal in our group tense with fear. From somewhere behind us came what sounded like a human scream, but distorted in ways that suggested it was being produced by vocal cords that were fundamentally different from our own. The sound rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost musical, but with an underlying quality that spoke to predatory intelligence. Rex began whimpering and pressed himself against my legs, his entire body trembling with terror. The cattle moved closer together, forming the kind of defensive circle that wild animals create when facing pack predators. Even our horses were showing signs of panic, fighting against the reins and trying to bolt in any direction that might lead away from the source of the sound. "What in God's name is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. Dad's face had gone white beneath his weathered tan. "I don't know," he replied, "but we can't stay here. We need to keep moving." As we resumed our desperate flight along the ridgeline, the sounds from behind us became more frequent and more varied. What had started as isolated vocalizations was evolving into a complex pattern of communication that seemed to involve multiple participants spread across a wide area. Whatever these creatures were, they were coordinating their movements with a level of sophistication that suggested intelligence far beyond what I had attributed to any wild animal. The trail along the ridge was narrow and exposed, offering spectacular views of the surrounding mountains, but also leaving us visible to anything that might be watching from the forested slopes below. Several times, I caught glimpses of movement in the trees that suggested we were being paralleled by creatures that could move through difficult terrain with surprising speed and agility. "There," Dad said suddenly, pointing toward a distant hillside where dark shapes were moving with obvious purpose. "Do you see them?" I followed his gaze and felt my mouth go dry as I spotted what appeared to be at least 3 large figures making their way up a slope that would have challenged experienced human climbers. The creatures moved with a fluid grace that seemed to ignore the difficulties of the terrain, covering ground at a rate that suggested they would be able to intercept our route within a matter of minutes. "How many are there?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "More than I can count," Dad replied grimly, "and they're getting ahead of us." The realization that we were being systematically outmaneuvered by creatures of unknown capabilities was terrifying beyond description. These mountains that I had considered familiar territory were being revealed as the domain of something far more dangerous and intelligent than I had ever imagined. As we continued along the ridgeline, the vocalizations from our pursuers became almost constant. The sounds seemed to be coming from all directions simultaneously, creating an acoustic environment that made it impossible to determine exactly where the various creatures were positioned. This psychological warfare was clearly having its intended effect. Both human and animal members of our group were showing signs of panic that threatened to compromise our ability to make rational decisions. "Listen," Dad said suddenly, holding up his hand for silence. In the distance, barely audible over the sound of wind through the trees, came the distinctive sound of a helicopter. The aircraft was still far away, but it was clearly approaching our general area with the kind of purposeful flight pattern that suggested an official mission rather than casual sightseeing. "Search and rescue?" I asked hopefully. Dad shook his head. "Wrong type of sound. That's military or maybe law enforcement, and it's coming from the direction of the deep wilderness, not from town." As the helicopter sound grew louder, the vocalizations from our pursuers suddenly stopped completely. The abrupt silence was more unnerving than the constant communication had been, suggesting that whatever was tracking us was capable of sophisticated responses to changing circumstances. Within minutes, the aircraft appeared over the horizon, a large, unmarked helicopter painted entirely in white. It was flying low and fast, following the valley floors with the kind of precision that suggested intimate familiarity with the terrain. As it passed overhead, I could see figures in the cockpit, but the aircraft showed no sign of having noticed our small group on the mountainside. "Where's it going?" I asked, watching as the helicopter disappeared over the next ridge. "Into the deep country," Dad replied. "The areas where nobody goes, the places where—" He paused, as if reluctant to finish the thought. "Where what?" "Where people have been reporting strange encounters for years. The places where experienced outdoorsmen refuse to go alone." As the sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, our pursuers resumed their vocalizations with renewed intensity. Whatever had caused them to fall silent during the aircraft's passage was no longer a concern, and their communication patterns suggested increased urgency and organization. "We need to get off this ridge," Dad said, spurring his horse toward a trail that led down into a wooded valley. "We're too exposed up here." But as we began our descent into the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. The creatures that had been pursuing us all morning had demonstrated intelligence and coordination that suggested they were capable of complex planning. Leading us away from open ground and into dense forest where visibility was limited seemed like exactly the kind of tactical decision they might make. As we entered the forest canopy, the oppressive silence returned with renewed intensity. But this time, it felt different. Not like the absence of sound, but like the calm before a storm. Whatever was going to happen next, I could sense that it was approaching rapidly, and I was terrified to find out what it would be. The autumn of 2019 arrived with an unseasonable warmth that extended well into October, giving me and my friend Garrett extra weeks to enjoy the outdoor activities that would soon be curtailed by winter weather. The events of that terrifying April morning had faded somewhat in my memory, reduced to the kind of half-remembered nightmare that seems less credible in daylight than it had in the moment of experience. Dad and I had never discussed in detail what we had encountered on the mountain that day. The official story was that we had seen evidence of trespassers and had taken the longer route home as a precautionary measure. But I could tell from the way his eyes would sometimes drift toward the mountain peaks during our daily work that the experience had left permanent marks on his psyche that no amount of time would completely erase. Garrett lived at our ranch with his family, occupying one of the smaller houses that accommodated seasonal workers and their dependents. At 15, he was 2 years younger than me, but possessed the kind of fearless enthusiasm for outdoor adventure that made him an ideal companion for exploring the vast wilderness that surrounded our property. The lake that bordered our ranch was a natural wonder that had provided entertainment and recreation for 3 generations of my family. Fed by mountain streams and spring runoff, it maintained a constant level throughout most of the year and supported a healthy population of fish that made it popular with local anglers. The shores were lined with a mixed forest of aspen and pine that provided excellent habitat for deer, elk, and the smaller animals that formed the foundation of the local ecosystem. Garrett and I had spent countless hours that summer building and improving a fort in the swampy woods that bordered the lake's eastern shore. The structure was nothing elaborate, just some salvaged lumber nailed together to create walls and a roof that would keep out most of the weather. But it represented a significant investment of time and effort, and it had become our primary hangout spot during the long summer afternoons. Access to the fort required crossing a small creek that flowed into the lake through a marshy area where the footing was uncertain and the water was often deeper than it appeared. Early in the summer, we had solved this problem by constructing a simple bridge using 4 wooden planks supported by rocks positioned at strategic points in the stream bed. The bridge had served us well throughout the summer months, supporting not only our own weight, but also that of the various supplies and materials we had transported to improve our fort. It was sturdy enough that we had never given any thought to its structural integrity or worried about its ability to continue serving our needs. But on that October afternoon when we approached the creek crossing, both Garrett and I stopped in shock at what we found. 2 of the 4 planks that formed our bridge had been snapped cleanly in half, leaving jagged ends that showed the bright, fresh color of recently broken wood. The breaks were not the result of gradual deterioration or normal wear. They showed the characteristics of sudden, violent failure under extreme stress. "What happened to our bridge?" Garrett asked, his voice reflecting the confusion I was feeling. I knelt beside the broken planks and examined them more closely. The wood was dry pine lumber that would normally require considerable force to break, especially given the dimensions of the planks we had used. But these breaks showed none of the splintering and tearing that would result from normal structural failure. Instead, they appeared to have been snapped with a single powerful application of force applied in exactly the right location to cause maximum damage. "Maybe a big animal stepped on it," I suggested, though my own words sounded unconvincing even to me. "What kind of animal would be heavy enough to break these boards?" Garrett replied. "And why would it step on the bridge instead of just wading through the creek?" The questions were valid, and they highlighted problems with the innocent explanation I was trying to convince myself to believe. The creek was shallow enough that any large animal could easily ford it without using our bridge. And the placement of the break suggested that whatever had caused the damage had deliberately targeted the bridge rather than accidentally encountering it. But I wasn't ready to confront the alternative explanations that were beginning to form in the back of my mind. The events of the previous spring felt like ancient history, and I had successfully convinced myself that they had been the result of overactive imagination combined with the kind of ordinary wildlife encounters that were common in such remote areas. "Probably just got overused," I said, forcing confidence into my voice that I didn't really feel. "We'll fix it later. Let's just jump across for now." We made our way across the creek using the remaining planks and a series of carefully placed hops that left us both slightly wet, but safely on the other side. The fort was exactly as we had left it the previous week. 4 walls of mismatched lumber surrounding a small interior space that contained a few pieces of salvaged furniture and some supplies we kept stored there for our various projects. We settled into our usual spots and began the kind of aimless conversation that filled our afternoons. Discussions of school, plans for upcoming hunting season, speculation about which girls might be interested in dating, and other topics that seemed incredibly important to teenagers, but would seem trivial to adults. The fort provided a sense of privacy and independence that was hard to find elsewhere on the ranch. But our conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of us freeze in sudden terror. It started as a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on wood with measured, deliberate strokes. The sound was coming from somewhere very close to our fort, possibly from one of the trees that formed the canopy overhead. "What's that?" Garrett whispered, his eyes wide with concern. I held up my hand for silence and focused my attention on the source of the sound. The tapping continued for perhaps 30 seconds, following a pattern that seemed almost like Morse code. 3 short taps, followed by 2 longer ones, then 3 short taps again. The rhythm was too regular to be natural, and the sound was too deliberate to be caused by any kind of random environmental factor. As the tapping continued, I felt the same sense of creeping dread that had characterized the morning encounter with Dad several months earlier. This wasn't the kind of innocent mystery that could be explained away with rational thought. This was something that demanded immediate action, preferably involving rapid movement away from our current location. "We need to leave," I said quietly, though I couldn't have explained the source of my certainty. "Right now." Garrett looked confused by my sudden change in mood, but something in my voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation. Without asking for further explanation, he began gathering up the personal items we had brought to the fort while I moved toward the opening that served as our door. The machinery yard that bordered the swampy woods was perhaps 100 yards from our fort, across an area of mixed forest and marshy ground that offered limited visibility but multiple routes of approach. The main shop building provided a clear view of the tree line, but reaching it would require crossing an open area where we would be exposed to observation from anyone or anything that might be watching from the woods. There was a gap in the barbed wire fence that surrounded the machinery yard, A small opening we had created earlier in the summer to provide easy access between our fort and the more civilized areas of the ranch. Reaching that gap had always been a simple matter of following a well-worn path through the forest. But suddenly the familiar route seemed fraught with danger. I whispered my plan to Garrett as quickly as possible, emphasizing the need for speed and stealth. We would leave the fort simultaneously, move through the forest in a crouched position to minimize our visibility, and make for the fence gap as quickly as possible without creating so much noise that we would attract attention. As we prepared to leave our sanctuary, the tapping sound stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was more frightening than the rhythmic noise had been, suggesting that whatever was making the sound had become aware of our presence and was changing its behavior accordingly. "Go," I whispered, and both of us burst from the fort at a dead run. But as I lifted my head to check our route toward the fence, I saw something that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Standing in a small clearing, perhaps 25 feet directly ahead of us, was a creature that defied every assumption I had made about the natural world. The creature that stood before us in that small clearing was unlike anything I had ever seen or imagined. At first glance, it appeared almost human, but every detail of its appearance reinforced the terrible reality that this was something fundamentally alien to our world. The face that stared back at us with obvious intelligence was a grotesque parody of human features, as if someone had attempted to create a person from memory, but had gotten all the proportions wrong. Its eyes were the most disturbing feature, too large for the skull that contained them, positioned too high on the forehead, and spaced too far apart to create the symmetrical arrangement that characterizes human faces. But what made them truly terrifying was their color, a sickly green that seemed to glow with its own internal light, creating the impression that we were being observed by something that belonged more to the realm of nightmares than to the natural world. The nose was pointed and oversized, projecting from the face like the beak of some enormous bird of prey. Below it, the mouth was a slash of darkness, from which protruded a single yellowed tooth that curved downward like a fang. The entire facial structure was covered with patches of coarse dark hair that failed to conceal the gray-green skin beneath. But it was the smell that nearly overwhelmed me, a combination of copper and stale cigarettes that seemed to coat the inside of my nostrils and throat with every breath. The odor was so intense and so unnatural that it triggered an immediate gag reflex, making it difficult to focus on the need to escape from our predicament. The creature's body was massive, easily 7 feet tall, and built with the kind of muscular development that suggested enormous physical strength. Its limbs were covered with the same patchy dark fur that marked its face, but in the exposed areas, I could see skin that was scarred and wounded in ways that spoke to a life of violence and hardship. For several seconds, we stood frozen in a tableau of mutual observation, two terrified teenagers facing something that challenged their understanding of reality, while the creature studied us with an intelligence that was clearly evaluating our potential as threats or prey. Time seemed suspended as both sides processed the implications of this unexpected encounter. Then the creature took a step forward, and the spell was broken. I turned and ran with a desperation that I had never experienced before, crashing through underbrush and leaping over obstacles with a recklessness that could easily have resulted in serious injury. Behind me, I could hear Garrett following, though his panicked screams of "Sasquatch" suggested that his mind was trying to process what we had seen by fitting it into familiar categories. But I knew that what we had encountered was not a Sasquatch or any other creature from folklore or legend. This was something far more disturbing, something that belonged in the space between known and unknown, challenging our most basic assumptions about what was possible in the natural world. The run back to the house seemed to take forever, though it probably covered less than half a mile of familiar ground. Every shadow between the trees seemed to hide potential threats, and every sound, no matter how innocent, triggered fresh waves of adrenaline that left me feeling nauseated and shaky. When we finally burst through the front door of the house, both of us were pale and trembling with the kind of shock that comes from confronting something that fundamentally challenges your understanding of reality. Garrett immediately began trying to call his parents, but his hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't operate his phone properly. "What did we just see?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, though part of me suspected that I knew exactly what we had encountered. The creature in the clearing bore an unmistakable resemblance to the figures Dad and I had glimpsed on the mountain months earlier. The same impossible height, the same mixture of human and animal characteristics, the same sense of intelligence that was both familiar and utterly alien. As we sat in the living room trying to process what had happened, I became aware of movement outside the house. Through the front windows, I could see across the yard to the grassy hills that rose beyond our property line. As I watched, a massive figure appeared on the skyline, moving with the kind of fluid speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "There," I said, pointing toward the distant hillside. "Do you see it?" Garrett followed my gaze, and his face went white as he spotted the same figure that had captured my attention. Even at a distance of perhaps half a mile, the creature's size was apparent. It moved across the landscape with enormous strides, covering ground at a rate that would have been impossible for any human being. "How can something that big move so fast?" Garrett whispered. I had no answer for his question. Everything about what we were witnessing defied rational explanation and challenged our understanding of what was physically possible. The creature disappeared over the hill within seconds, leaving us with nothing but the memory of its impossible speed and size. That night, both Garrett and I stayed awake in the living room, too frightened to risk sleeping in separate rooms. We played video games and watched television, desperately trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in the face of experiences that had shattered our assumptions about the world we lived in. When my parents and brother returned from their evening activities around 9:30, they immediately sensed that something was wrong, but neither Garrett nor I felt capable of explaining what we had encountered. How do you tell responsible adults that you've seen something that shouldn't exist? How do you describe an experience that sounds like the product of overactive imagination or adolescent hysteria? We retreated to my bedroom, where the familiar surroundings provided some illusion of safety and security. But even there, surrounded by the possessions and memories of a normal teenage life, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched by something that existed outside the boundaries of normal experience. At approximately 2 a.m., Garrett shook me awake from the light doze I had finally managed to achieve. His face was white with terror, and his finger was pressed to his lips in a gesture demanding absolute silence. As I became fully alert, I heard what had woken him: a soft, rhythmic tapping on my bedroom window. The sound was identical to what we had heard at the fort earlier that day. Measured, deliberate taps that followed a pattern suggesting intelligence and purpose. But hearing it here, at my bedroom window in the middle of the night, transformed it from mysterious to absolutely terrifying. We sat frozen on my bed, afraid to move or speak or even breathe too loudly. The tapping continued for perhaps 2 minutes, following the same pattern we had heard earlier. 3 short taps, 2 long ones, then 3 short taps again. It was like some kind of code, a form of communication that we couldn't understand, but that clearly carried meaning for whatever was producing it. Then the tapping stopped, and we heard the sound of my fence creaking under some tremendous weight. The metal posts and wire that formed our property boundary were designed to contain livestock, not to support the weight of something that could make them groan and complain, as if they were being tested to their breaking point. A loud snap echoed through the night air, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Whatever had been putting pressure on our fence had finally exceeded its structural limits and had caused some component of the system to fail catastrophically. We remained frozen on the bed for another hour, listening for any additional sounds that might indicate continued presence of whatever had visited us. But gradually, the normal sounds of night returned. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through leaves, the small movements of nocturnal animals going about their business. When morning finally arrived, I crept outside to assess the damage to our property. The fence showed clear evidence of having been subjected to enormous pressure. Several posts were bent out of alignment, and one section of wire had been snapped completely. My hockey stick, which had been leaning against the fence, was broken in half and lay scattered across the yard. The road hockey ball that had been nearby was completely flattened, as if it had been stepped on by something weighing hundreds of pounds. Across the road, I could see our neighbors loading their daughters into their car with the kind of urgency that suggested they too had experienced something disturbing during the night. The girls appeared to be in a state of hysteria, crying and clinging to their parents in ways that spoke to genuine terror rather than ordinary childhood upset. I wanted to approach them and ask what they had seen, but some instinct warned me that drawing attention to the previous night's events might not be wise. Whatever had visited our property had demonstrated intelligence and purpose that suggested it was capable of much more than simple vandalism or mischief. That incident marked the end of our encounters with the creatures that inhabited the deeper wilderness areas surrounding our ranch. In the weeks and months that followed, life returned to something approaching normal routine. But I never again felt completely secure when working or playing in the forested areas of our property. The events of that spring and autumn had revealed the existence of something that challenged every assumption I had made about the natural world. Somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded our ranch, creatures existed that combined human intelligence with physical capabilities that defied explanation. They had demonstrated awareness of our presence, the ability to communicate with each other across considerable distances, and the capacity for behavior that suggested complex planning and coordination. Most disturbing of all, they had shown that they were capable of venturing beyond their wilderness territory to investigate and interact with human settlements. The visit to our house in the middle of the night had been a deliberate act of reconnaissance, a gathering of information about our capabilities and vulnerabilities. I have never spoken publicly about these experiences until now, partly because I knew that few people would believe such an account, and partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to attract the attention of whatever agencies might be interested in such reports. The unmarked helicopter we had seen on the mountain suggested that someone in authority was already aware of the situation and was taking steps to monitor or control it. But as I have grown older and gained perspective on these events, I have come to believe that there are things in our world that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional knowledge. The creatures we encountered were not supernatural or mythological. They were flesh and blood entities that had found ways to survive and thrive in environments that most humans never penetrate. They may still be out there, in the deep wilderness areas where few people venture, and fewer still return to tell their stories. And sometimes late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees and the shadows are deep and dark, I wonder if they remember us as clearly as we remember them. The thought that we might one day meet again fills me with a terror that time has done nothing to diminish.